I'd like to now transition into our keynote session on looking at this idea of vocation. And I want to introduce to you Dr. Michael Naughton, Director of the Center for Catholic Studies at UST. He's an expert in the interdisciplinary engagement between Catholic social thought and business. Dr. Naughton is a nationally celebrated scholar and teacher. In partnership with the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, he led the development of this handbook that's in your packet, The Vocation of the Business Leader, a resource that provides the practical guidance for informed by Catholic social teaching to those in the business world. And so when we were conceiving of this idea, we were inspired by this document, but really thought we need a document on the agricultural leader. And that's what inspired this conference on faith, food, and the environment, the vocation of the agricultural leader, was this work by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace in partnership with the John Ryan Institute for Catholic Social Thought and the Center for Catholic Studies. So this particular piece, Mike is going to, I want to allow Dr. Naughton to present to you on the question of work and a revisiting of the idea of vocation. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Michael Naughton.
I'm wondering if you can all stand up for 1 second. Quick stretch. Now all sit down. That's your break. Sorry about that, but that'll be great. It is indeed a great honor to be here at this conference, and I am so grateful to Jim Ennis for his leadership in addressing these types of questions and seeing this project of the Vocation Business Leader be expanded, particularly into this question, such an important question of the vocation of the agricultural leader. I'm also particularly grateful to Father Michael Cherney and Cardinal Turkson, who have really played a critical role to make these things go forward. Without their leadership, I just don't think we'd be sitting here today. My hope this afternoon is to give a presentation that will kind of give you a sense of what this vocation of business leader is about, and then begin to explore what are the implications of this for the vocation of the agricultural leader. But in order to do this, I wonder if you'd just give me a little time to maybe tell a story which I think actually gets at a critical lesson about why this topic that we're dealing with is so important. And it's a story about when I was a teenager. I grew up in the south side of Chicago, and both my parents were from Ireland. And like every teenager, you have the troubles at that particular time. And as I was walking out the door one day, my father looked at me and he said, Michael, you be a good boy, Michael. I said, sure, Dad, whatever. And before I can take another step, he looked at me, he says, Michael, if you can't be good, you be careful. All right. Well, an unfortunate event happened to me that night, and my father had to come pick me up from a Chicago police station. I'll spare you the details about why that was the case. And he walks into the police station, he looks at me, he says, Michael, I think you better just be good. Right? And the point is, of course, is that we often tend to live in a culture that tends to focus on simply being careful. We have a culture of designated drivers, right? Safe and careful drivers who take home drunk and stupid friends. We have this whole idea called safe sex, somehow thinking that non-productive, disease-free sex makes up for its unitive and procreative meaning. We speak to our children about getting to the next step, getting the right grade, getting the next score, and yet we have children who have lost the love of learning. And we have our own career strategies, which are so riddled with such massive change that they demand a great deal of caution. And if we are not careful in the work that we do, we will find ourselves dinosaurs on the proverbial dung heap of antiquated practices and bankrupt institutions. But if we are only careful and cautious, we can distract ourselves from the deeper questions of the good of the community, of the common good, of those goods that bind us together in the work that we do, which is at the fundamental basis of what it means to be human. In this talk, what I'd like to do is speak to you about particularly this document, but again, always keeping in mind that we're moving to the agricultural leader. But it's really about what is the good that business does? What is the good that agricultural does? And I'd like to do it in 4 steps. The first, I'd like to simply talk about the context and the challenges of this document and where it came from. I'd then like to talk about the 3 words of the document: vocation, business, and leader. All 3, I think, very significant. Then I'd like to talk about the structure of the document, see, judge, act, and then turn this over to your tables for conversations. So, first, the context. This document was released in 2012 by Cardinal Turkson in front of 2,000 business executives in Lyon, France. And the seminar, as Father Czerny pointed out, was a seminar that we had at the Pontifical Council. And I would say that Jim Ennis actually explained this to me one time, which I think caught the exact purpose or the exact task of what we're trying to do. Many of you know, particularly in farming, that it takes about 40 to 50 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. We have a 2,000-year-old tradition of both Catholics and Protestants, of a religious tradition, of a very extensive social tradition. It is a lot of stuff, but most business people and most practitioners don't know quite what to do with it. And this document was an attempt to try to boil it down in such a way to draw upon the depths of that, to convey that and communicate that to the people who, in a sense, are living the day-to-day reality of business. A good friend of mine, Jack Fortin, who used to be over at the Luther Seminary, once said to me, he says, the challenge we have in this culture is how do we speak from our deepest center, not from our lowest boundaries. We live in a culture that tends to go to the lowest common denominator. Yes, it's safe. Yes, it's careful. But it's pretty bland, and it rarely inspires anybody. Speak from your center in such a way that you invite the others to do the same. And that's exactly what this document is attempting to do. Speak from the deepest faith center that we have. But let's do it in such a way that we want to have a conversation and we want to have dialogue, as Father Czerny pointed out. So that's where the document came out of. There's lots of challenges of creating a document like this, and believe me, there are moments when we were in writing this document where I thought it never would see the light of day. I can't go through all of those, but let me highlight what I would call the 2-ditch problem of trying to do anything like this. And the first ditch is actually laid out right in the document itself, and it says this in the document, and it's what we might call accommodationalism. Christians have accommodated themselves to the world, living as if God does not exist. They not only live in the world, but they have become of the world. When Christian business leaders fail to live the gospel in their organizations, their lives conceal rather than reveal the authentic face of God and religion. The challenge for many of us in our faith is how do we live our faith in this world, and how do we, in a sense, prevent the idea of assimilation? I once was doing some surveys of business faculty at Catholic universities, and this one faculty member from finance once said this to me about his fellow people in finance. He says, if I believed in God as much as they believed in the market, I'd be a mystic, right? There are some times that we look out in the world, yes, we have to realize the importance of the market, but the market will never solve all our problems, just like the state will never solve all our problems. Faith is a very important reality that we have to come into. But this is not just the problem, by the way, for business people or Christian business people. This, I have to say, is a major problem for the church itself. And if there's anybody who's been kind of battering this theme, has been Francis. Francis says, the worldly spirit kills, it kills people, and it kills the church. To be quite frank, some churches, you couldn't tell that it would even have a faith tradition. It often operates and acts in the same way that any other organization that would be. And this is not only parishes and dioceses, this is universities, Catholic healthcare systems, social services. The church itself has to be a beacon of light if it's expected that business people are to be a beacon of light. So this is a problem. The problem, lots to be discussed about, but the biggest problem that often it generates is the second ditch. It tends to generate anti-business attitudes, which is another whole set of problems. What occurs is when people look at all these problems, they lose faith in business and they lose faith in institutions. And thus, all one can get is what we might call prophetic denunciations of business. And the solution to business then simply becomes regulation, as though regulation will be seen as something to solve the problem. There's a lot more to be discussed about, but let's be mindful that when we move into this direction, we will have challenges and we will have problems to deal with. But despite all that, we have a great tradition. We have a great tradition in which to draw upon, great resources to draw upon, resources in the sense what the world can, in a sense, benefit from. So let me move to the three words of this document, and let me move to the first word of vocation. At the heart of vocation starts off in the very first words of this document, paragraph 1, where it says this: For everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much will be asked. I would call it the logic of gift. And I'll come back to this at the end of the talk, but let me say it simply here as this. There are two major realities of this logic of gift and what this is, and it's this. The business people and people in agriculture and people in the professions have been given great resources. That's the giftedness reality. And in that gift, the Lord asks them to do great things. This is at the heart of the vocation of which, in a sense, the document speaks about. But this logic of gift is very different than often what the logic of what many business have to deal with, which we might call the logic of the market. Because what the logic of the market will often talk about is that there is nothing giving. Things are only acquired and chosen. Life is a struggle simply between humanity and nature. And what you get out of nature is what you assail by her. And thus, life is simply about choices. I came across recently a book by Philip Reif called The Triumph of the Therapeutic, and I think he catches very clearly this contrast between the logic of the gift and the logic of the market. And he basically contrasts it with this idea of the difference between free to choose and being chosen. This is what he says in one brief sentence, which I think captures the problem, and is this: there is no more feeling more desperate than that of being free to choose, and yet without the specific compulsion of being chosen. But the logic of the market, when it's only done by itself, and let me be very clear, the logic of the market is a very important logic, but it can't explain reality by itself. But the market often says that the highest value is choice itself, not the content of the choice. And what Reif, I think, is pointing out quite clearly is choice by itself does not have the capacity to give meaning to the work that we have. He makes very clear that there's a psychological perplexity that we face when we are only left with our choices. Another voice that gets at this is a man named D.H. Lawrence, the great literary writer at the beginning of the 20th century. And Lawrence puts it in very provocative ways, and he says this. He says, men are not free when they are doing just what they like. The moment you can do just what you like, there's nothing you care about doing. Men are free when they are obeying some deep inward voice of religious belief. Once we sever the relationship of being free to choose and being chosen, what eventually begins to happen is that we take our choices less seriously. And eventually what begins to happen is that there's only one value, and the value becomes price. And so this idea of vocation is, I think, a very critical term, particularly in the modern culture that we live in. What makes our choices serious? And what gives it that seriousness? But this idea of vocation has to be done within an institution. And that's why the word business is such an important thing. We live our lives through institutions, and we live our vocation through institutions. And so we have to find ways to engage this question with the institution that we find ourselves engaging with. Unfortunately, we sometimes have too narrow of an understanding, particularly of business or whatever institution we might be dealing with. And what the document points out is that business has a great variety of forms, and we should be thinking much broadly. And it seems to me that what's said in this document also relates to agriculture. Here's what it says about business. It says, business institutions are highly diverse, including cooperatives, multinational corporations, small entrepreneurial startups, employee-owned businesses, family businesses. Some of these businesses are publicly traded stock companies, while most are privately held. Some have revenues larger than many countries, but most are small. Some are owned by thousands of investors. Others are owned by a single person or family. What the point is that there's a wide variety of forms, and each institutional form will have its own particular challenge. But its common task, if one takes vocation seriously, is how does this deep sense of vocation, how does this deep logic of gift begin to translate itself within these institutions? In 2009, Benedict XVI wrote an encyclical called Caritas in Veritate, and he said this. He said, the great challenge before us in the document, he says, is how does this logic of gift find itself expressed in business and its relationships? And he states that this logic of gift should help us have a profoundly new way of understanding the business enterprise. So, business, the institution. And then thirdly, the word, leadership. Unfortunately, an overused word. Some of us get a little tired of it, but still nonetheless a very important word we want to deal with. I was struck by Amy Klobuchar's example of that woman from Africa talking about herself as a leader. In the document, it speaks about three audiences with the idea of leadership. And in the document, it says, we wish to speak specifically to Christian business leaders. And here the reason why the document does it is that faith is not merely a private or emotive reality. This often becomes the major problem for us living in America. We often reduce faith to simply a private and emotive reality, and there are social implications to faith. And the teachers of the faith are under a solemn vow to teach about that in all seasons and in all places, which is why the church needs to speak about the question of the church. But it also points out that the document is about wanting to wish to speak to business leaders of goodwill. And here I need to speak specifically as a Catholic and the church coming out of the Pontifical Council. The church is not a sect. It is not only concerned about speaking to itself. It wants to speak to the world, both in terms of, in a sense, giving its riches to the world and also learning from the world. The church is very clear. It does not have a monopoly on the good. It realizes that goodness comes from all sorts of people. And that is why you want to have dialogue and you want to have engagement as you move forward in that. And the third thing it points out is that the document talks about speaking to CEOs, the heads of teams, to those with informal influence. And here what it does is essentially says this. Leadership, yes, it's a title. Titles are important, but titles never exhaust leadership. What leadership is about is exercising influence. One of the most complimentary things someone could say to you in an organization is when they say, you have more influence than your title indicates, right? And here we want to be very clear that when we speak about leadership, we need to speak about it in those ways. So these are the three words. And in light of those three words, this document is structured in a particular way. But let me just say one quick story. When I was on the committee of putting this document together, the first draft of the committee was written by one of our colleagues, Bob Kennedy, and it had some influence by some other academics. And we gave it to the committee, waiting to see what they might say about this document. And this, of course, where humility needs to be a very important virtue. And one of the CEOs on the committee, his name is Pierre Lecoq. He's the CEO of a $2 billion automobile supply parts company in Paris. Says, you know, this is very interesting. And by the way, whenever someone says this about, you know, you're dead in the water, it's going to go downhill from there. He says, but a business person won't get this. And we said, all right. All right, we'll take that. It was written by academics. And then we said, well, how do you think a business person, what would they get? What kind of structure would they have? And he was the one that came up with this idea of the structure of seeing, judging, and acting. And it was his idea that this document should be structured in this way: see, judge, and act. It's very interesting. Thomas Aquinas, when he speaks about practical wisdom, will often speak about it in these ways: seeing reality, judging with the right principles, and acting in a way that's consistent with that reality and those principles. So let me say a few things about this structure: see, judge, and act. Seeing. What does the business person see? The business person sees permanent whitewater. The changes and the level of changes and the rapidity of these changes are absolutely astounding. In the document, it talks about four things. It talks about globalization, communication technology, financialization of the economy, and cultural changes. Many of those themes were actually, in a sense, chosen by the business people on the committee, because they say these are the things that we're dealing with. There's a lot to be said about all four of those. But one of the things I want to be clear about, or be careful about, is that when you talk about seeing reality, seeing these things are not simply about citing facts and data. How we have to always be asking ourselves is the way that we see reveal reality, or does it conceal it? And so the idea of seeing and seeing reality needs to be, in a sense, understood more broadly. And so the document often talks about this idea that what we need to see are seeing things whole and not seeing mere parts. And to see things whole is to see things in relationship to each other. This is a major point by Cardinal Newman when he talks about the importance of a university. How can we create students? How can we teach in such a way so people can see things in relationship to each other that allows them to form judgments about the overall nature of the realities they encounter? Chris Thompson's going to be talking about the importance of human ecology. And it seems to me the whole idea of human ecology is premised on this very fact of seeing things in relationship to each other. But this is not easy in our culture. I think one of the most important philosophers out there is a man named Alistair McIntyre. And he's argued that many of the leaders don't see whole because their universities have instead provided them an unimaginative, narrow, specialized training that has produced minds incapable of evaluating the full conditions behind them. He talks about the temptations of specialization that creates a syndrome of disconnection. And then he goes on to talk about examples. The first example is the recent financial crisis, where some of the brightest technicians engineered the economy to near disaster. The Iraq War, a military technical strategy of shock and awe, but the inability to understand the complex realities that led to utter disaster after the war. And in this now 25th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution, we had a whole State Department that could not see the importance of religion. McIntyre points out that this is a serious problem. But the other idea of seeing is to see beyond neighbors to seeing the image of God. And this becomes a very important part, how to see the invisible image in the visible form. So seeing, a very important reality. But when we see, we've already moved into the idea of judgment. And what the document then points out is how do you understand the idea of judgment, and what do you make the judgments based on within business? And in it, it provides a frame of three goods to business. And it talks about it in this way: good goods, good wealth, and good work. And so good goods is making goods which are truly good and services that truly serve. Good work, organizing work where employees develop their gifts and talents. And good wealth, creating sustainable wealth and distributing it justly. A best way of seeing this is to see it in a sense of concentric circles. What a business does, and what any good institution does, it has institutional goods. And it's very hard for the institution to do that all at the same time. When business does all three of these things, it is succeeding greatly. But it is very hard in business to do all three well, all at the same time. And maybe that might be an interesting part of the discussion when we move to that. Again, a lot more to be said, but time is running on. But let me go to the third. So we talked about seeing, judging, And now the question of acting. Acting. How does one act? And how does one act in such a way that one has deep roots rather than simply cut flowers? Before the fall, Enron touted its corporate values as integrity, respect, excellence, and communication, but obviously it failed in living it out. While Enron is an extreme example, the challenge of institutions is how does it develop a deep root system to resist the pressure of corruption that's often found in the marketplace? How does it, in a sense, fail in falling into the kind of drooping of the flowers that occur? An ethic that fails to be grounded and rooted in something deeper will always be prone to grow cold and fail to renew itself. Like cut flowers, they may appear to look vital and robust, but they eventually decompose since there's no relational and cultural resources to draw upon. In business, as well as in agriculture, life grinds on too hard for often value constructs to hold over a lifetime. So this document is an attempt to provide a way of acting and talk about that acting. And there are two ways that the document speaks about acting, and then I'll begin to summarize. And it is this, and it gets back to this logic of gift. And the first act is the act of receiving. The person comes to the profoundest sense of himself, not through what he does, but through what he accepts, not through what he achieves, but he receives. In many respects, this can be the most difficult act of the leader, because often the leader is always concerned about their own achievements. But the first thing they need to do is to receive. In the document, it talks about receiving the sacraments, to accept the scriptures, to honor the Sabbath, to pray, and to participate in the disciplines of the spiritual life. Because without the deep well of reflection, contemplation, and prayer, it is hard to see how a business person or any professional can resist the negative dimensions that often come from financialization, technological overload, and competitive situations that they find themselves in. If I could put it this way, it's a thesis. If we don't get receiving right, we'll never get work right or giving right. If we don't get leisure right, we won't get work right. If we don't get the Sabbath right, we won't get business right. This act of receptivity that's found within the importance of vocation is of critical importance, particularly in a highly secular technological age that we find ourselves in. And yet, we are not simply about receiving, we are also about giving. And the second act to which the church calls the business leader is to give in a way that which responds to that which has been received. That is, we have to find ways of expressing and institutionalizing through practices and policies, ways that one can, in a sense, make good goods, good work, and good wealth. Again, a lot more to be said on this, but you have been a very patient group, and what I want to now do is then turn it to your tables to start asking the questions. In light of this document, what does this mean for the agricultural leader? And what can be started to be discussed over this? So here are your questions. The first one dealing with the question of vocation. How does one's vocation inform the complexities and challenges of the agricultural marketplace? How would one manage such complexities as if faith mattered? And you may have other questions beside this one, but it's the one I can come up with. And then if one took the threefold structure of the document, seeing and judging and acting, seeing, what do you see are the principal challenges and opportunities within agriculture? Judging, what principles do you think are most important in defining the good agriculture does? And thirdly, act. What are the necessary actions of the agriculture leader? You, of course, may have your own questions, but this becomes now the time that we'll turn this back to your small groups to begin to engage these questions, and then we'll have people at each of the tables who will be taking notes and, in a sense, gathering this information as we begin to move to this question of the agricultural leader. So now it's time for you to talk. Go to it. Thank you.